Before I get to the questions, I can't resist making a few comments. And the first thing I want to ask all of you for a round of applause for this extraordinary woman. I don't know about the rest of you, but I very rarely go to conferences where I'm mesmerized for a whole day. And that's also due to the remarkable presentations and the work that was done by the students and the architects. So I'm indebted to you for organizing this. When I went to architecture school, and once upon a time I was an architect, they told me that housing hadn't changed in 3,000 years, and it wouldn't change. Well, today, that's proven wrong. And we've seen many different sorts of things. And what struck me about it is that unlike the housing world that I entered into 40 years ago as a young man in the planning department, this was about neighborhoods. It wasn't R10, high-rise, high-density. These were actual neighborhoods, buildings which were adjusted to the characteristics of those neighborhoods, which were not intrusive in their design, although in many cases violated the zoning requirements. One of the things that I found particularly interesting was that they were adaptable. Whether you stuck 1, 2, 3, 4, or 7 additions onto that house in Ravenswood, Queens, or whether you changed a unit that was being used by a family to with children. Fascinating that these were all things that revolved around the notion of change. One of the things that I complain about all the time in my teaching of architects is stop thinking of an end state. The world moves on. Things change all the time. And there's a tendency to think this is a perfect artwork, it's not going to change. I have 2 strong recommendations in going further before I ask you all questions. And the first is to stop thinking only in terms of physical space. The most important thing is to look at cost. And the highest portion of that cost is operating costs. It does no good to make a saving of 100 square feet and the debt service on that if the operating cost in terms of electricity is going to go up. And if you have to ventilate it with an air conditioner and you have to have electric lights on all the time, which in many cases you do because you had interior rooms we were looking at, air shafts that they opened onto and so on, you're going to lose the benefit. So as you go through the next step here, it seems to me you have to look at the thing in terms of the economic cost, the economic rent, that is the operating costs, the real estate taxes that you're going to have to pay. In the last presentation certainly dramatized that. The debt service, and see what's involved. The other thing that I would recommend is to think about this in terms of financing. These things have to go to a bank or to an insurance company or to some form of lender, and you've got to go through the processing of it, and we need to have a way of dealing with it that will be understandable to the lending community. Those are my suggestions. My first question is to Rosanne. Do you think you could put together a coalition of people who represented the general interest and stand up to NIMBY?
She does it every day.
Yeah, that's. I actually think the framing of this whole conference is a good answer to that question, which is there are more people on the kind of deprivation side of this question of not having enough housing choice than ever before in terms of seniors, young people, immigrant families. I think we are at a moment where we actually can mobilize a lot of constituencies to ask why New York isn't more efficient, more innovative, more concerned about housing safety for all. that this is actually
But they
a
have
very
to
good.
appear at the planning commission and the city council and the community board, or else we never can get any of this to happen.
I think yes and no. I think the possibility is there, and I think you see a whole lot of voices represented here that wouldn't typically have been in this conversation even 5 years ago. But I also like Ted's point about, can we push the boundaries of what's even available now in the building code? Can we start more modestly? Can we look at a series of pilot projects? I think we saw a cluster of amazing ideas around a few typologies, micro units, shared arrangements, accessory dwelling units, maybe without making a dramatic assault on the current codes. We can do some pretty powerful things within the codes with modest changes to show more people in New York what we're missing out on.
David, if we made some of those, could we actually get changes in definition? Do you think it's possible to get around the constant carping from all sides by simply changing definitions of the word family or the word room or the word multiple dwelling? There are a set of these things that one small change could revolutionize the landscape.
Yeah, I think this is a situation where the sort of terminology and the regulatory environment has fallen behind society. I mean, these things are already out there. They're happening. I mean, people are living in multiple families in the one dwelling. Some are underoccupied, some are overoccupied. And we still cling to these old nuclear family concepts. So I think it's time for that terminology and that regulatory environment just to catch up with reality would be a good start.
Geraldine, we're going to have a new mayor in 2 years. What chances are there for CHPC to put together an agenda of these things that we could advocate so that the next mayor would implement them, because it cannot be done in any less time than we will be facing an election?
Yeah, well, I think the opportunity is huge right now for just the reasons that David just said. It's already happening. I mean, one of the things that I think people reacted to, and, Sarah and I have spent the last 2.5 years sort of talking to any group of 3 or more people who would, listen to us on this issue. And we got a lot of, I don't want to say hostility, but there's still this vision of a very sort of demonized single adult population. There's still this vision of if you change something, the worst that you could possibly imagine in life is going to befall you, And I think, what we showed in just sort of the simple maps that we put up there today is, this population is there. It's in Woodside, it's in Sunnyside, it's in Elmhurst, it's in Jamaica, it's in Coney Island, it's in the Northwest Bronx. It's everywhere. It's on Staten Island. So the question really is not sort of what's the maximum that we could do? It's, as a society, what's the floor that we're willing to accept for people? So if we do not want to accept the fact that people are living in some pretty bad conditions, whether even if they're physically nice, they could be legally exploitative, I think this is the moment to let reality just let our regulatory framework catch up with the reality of who we really are. And are we really serious about, we see ourselves, and our rhetoric as a city is about this wonderful melting pot and this place where we're welcoming for everyone in the world. And that's how we like to see ourselves. But then we think everyone should just have a 2-bedroom apartment and, get married and have 2 kids. And if they don't do that, we kind of don't want them living near us. But that's the mythology. That's not the reality. So I think whoever the next mayor is going to be faced with a lot of challenges around the issues of making room. And I think they go to the heart of a lot of issues that are raised in Plan YC, not just this one. But how are you going to make room for all these people? What's the floor that you're willing to accept? And can't we just say they're here, they're part of our society, they're not just a part, they're important. And I definitely think there will be people that disagree, but I think this is the moment, because I don't think there's anybody who doesn't know someone who, when you looked at these designs, you said, oh, wow, this person I know could really be served well if they live there. I mean, we all know those people.
The other thing that
now
was
we know
on,
your children, so
Exactly. My kids are definitely there, but there's a lot of people.
another thing that those presentations indicated very clearly is there are plenty of sites out there. The notion that there are no sites to build this housing is nonsense. They're all over the place. Asby, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Okay.
If you were to pick, because you started out telling us about how wonderful these things are, which one would you pick to build?
I want to evade that question. Although I suppose one that I liked in a pure design sense was the last one that Ted showed that the student at Columbia worked at. It had a lot that I like in architecture, but I really, of ones that I really like to see happen, the Barnacle houses were, I think, great and fantastic, and sort of utilize this existing vernacular of how we have been adding to houses.
one
in
for
a long time.
Ravenswood.
Yes,
Yeah.
that was great. I would really like to see that happen. I think it would. And I also liked the one on the concourse. I think I'm not that familiar with the area, but it has such a wonderful range of specificity, of potential unique spatial configuration of the street, history, and great need. And I thought that the way that those proposals sort of addressed so many issues at the same time was really, really wonderful. But I have to say, the other day we had a big meeting. We saw a lot of these proposals still in flux, and I just was almost overwhelmed because I felt like so many fantastic ideas were being generated around a certain set of problems that were very, very beautifully defined by Geraldine and by Sarah, what the issues were. And I thought that we're witnessing the emergence of a new school of thought. And right now, it is really dealing with the issues of New York in particular, but it is part of a set of global conditions that we're seeing manifested in many different ways in different parts of the world that bring together these demographic changes, environmental issues, economic difficulties, issues of history, culture, of immigration and movement of population. And I think many parts of the world will be able to learn from this experience as it's developed further, just as people who are working on these issues here can learn from what's happening all over, including, of course, Mexico, possibly Japan, possibly parts of Europe. So it's really been a remarkable thing. I don't want to pick a favorite, but there was a few that I felt, yes, I can really see this happening, and it would be really beautiful for the people who could live there.
How do the rest of you feel?
I, again, hesitate to pick favorites. I thought the micro units in the first presentation, the micro studios, were a terrific concept. I was really intrigued with the Barnacle houses. I thought that the Columbia project and Jonathan Kirschenfeld's Grand Concourse project all had features of, they were staying within kind of a known form, and that they appealed to me in part because they were very buildable. I could imagine with a small set of waivers and the disposition on the part of city agencies to allow some ideas to be tested, because it's so important that we figure it out, that those could actually be developed into real projects.
Could you operate those buildings if you, as an agency, had those buildings to operate?
Absolutely, and in fact, as others have said in these discussions, there's plenty of experience in New York already, whether it's in supportive housing or other assisted housing, or just in some interesting kind of shared but informal arrangements where people kind of understand now what it takes to manage a diverse environment where. And I thought the conversation about allocating the common space and having clear responsibility and management accountability for it is the key. But it's not so much, can these buildings be managed? I think how much of a leap do they require in terms of bending financing, bending existing zoning? I'd rather get started with some important tests of concept soon than spend the next several years revising codes. And I think actually this is a case, to David and Geraldine's point, where because reality is already, kind of different than our codes, by stretching our codes a bit, we can actually probably accelerate change more quickly than stopping to get everything perfect.
David, how would you go about changing some of the things that need to be changed?
Yeah, I know. Bob Lavandry kind of dodged that question, didn't he? I think earlier on.
Well, that's why I'm here.
No, and obviously it's complex. I mean, to me, one of the things, today we've talked a lot about design, and there have been some extremely inventive and creative solutions to all these different housing types. And it just shows you that it's not really a design problem, or at least design isn't the obstacle. It's the way we deliver housing that's the problem. And it's partly finance, and let's not, we talk about how to do things more cheaply and so on, but until this country gets its head around the fact that housing is so capital intensive, it can't be done by the individual. The rest of the world does it with central government financing. And, if we can spend 10 billion a month on wars and giving taxes to the rich, we can get a little bit back and spend something on housing. I think at some point, this country has to do that if we're ever going to tackle that problem of not only the people who are living in substandard housing, but the people who are, 35 million who spend 50% of their income on housing. It's unconscionable. And I know we're supposed to be the center of laissez-faire capitalism and all that, but a little bit of government subsidy would be helpful. And then I think the regulatory stuff, it just needs to be unraveled. I think we need some test cases. I think if we really did take one of these and run it through the pilot, Villa Verde is a very interesting example, actually, of a very unusual typology of mixing so many different housing types and uses into one building. And they've done it. It's going to open next year. It really can be done. I'd like to give a shout out to one other thing. You mentioned earlier neighborhoods. I think we've talked a lot today about the design of the housing unit, but I would hope we would not forget about the neighborhood and not allow it to be housing to be siloed. I think we have to think about open space and access to transit and social amenities and the public place that we're building whole communities, and not just, because I think that's been one of the problems with our delivery systems, that we tend to rush out and build some senior housing, and then we rush out and we build some subsidized, or we build some one families, and we don't really take a more holistic view of the neighborhoods we're creating.
Well, part of that has to do with, I believe, a skewed view of what planning is about. It should not be about telling other people what to do with their property. It should be about dealing with the property that we own right now. The last presentation showed the Grand Concourse as this grand room and said, well, all you need to do is green it. Well, I agree. But I think some of the things that are going on with our streets at the moment and our public spaces, the Green Streets program, the Parks Department has been running, that reclaims leftover traffic triangles, has done more to change the character of these neighborhoods. The neighborhoods would agree to accept all kinds of things if, in fact, they felt they were the recipients of investment. And it's time that we started thinking of investing in these neighborhoods in a very specific way. When I was on a young man, the Planning Commission drafted the first version of the capital budget of the city of New York and a 5-year capital program. The Charter of 75 took it away from the Planning Commission, and I would sit on the commission and listen to people from Staten Island object to rezoning a manufacturing area because, correctly, they said the streets have too much traffic on them, we can't handle it now, and the schools are over capacity. In the old days, the Planning Commission could have put a school in the next budget. And we need to get back to start thinking about investing in our neighborhoods. And then a lot of this neighborhood opposition will begin to evaporate. But that's my view.
It strikes me that there are a few things, though, that really do merit maybe more immediate and global attention. Just the definition of a household. It seems as though we're on the wrong side of the law there in a whole host of ways. We should get rid of that. Also, I think it's just a perennial question why some of our affordable housing production programs have higher standards with respect to room sizes and are more restrictive than market rate projects. It just seems as though if we're going to invest in innovation and in solving and creating a safer and more choice-filled floor for all New Yorkers, we should be using our public housing finance streams more creatively.
Yeah, and I think that there were, I mean, we had a wonderful, I'll sort of echo Asby, we had sort of a wonderful day on Friday with all the architectural teams presenting their work and just this, really lively cross-discussion. And I think we were talking about Jonathan's work, which is, really kind of, in some ways, I think the most provocative, because he's just saying, we already have a framework, it's called Use Group 3, it's already being built, but it's only applied to supportive housing, which means it can only be rented by special needs populations, and just let those rules apply, right? So when you look at it, I mean, sort of the oddity for me is sort of the parking, so, if you're...
That can be changed,
If
too.
you're, well, but, to live in a building without a parking requirement, you have to be, like, certified homeless, mentally ill. If you're just like somebody who isn't mentally ill, it's like you have to be mentally ill to want to live without a parking space or something. There was just something sort of really, crazy about the way we think about these rules.
And in the
know?
transit capital of the United States.
In the transit capital of the United States. And I think, the other thing that for me, the designs kind of surprised in a way, how many also began to push the envelope on living and working, on residential and commercial, or residential and industrial. And I have to say, those were some of my favorite options that got put up here, because that wasn't really the scope of our project. I mean, we were really trying to kind of stay on this idea of like rethinking what happens inside a residential unit. But yeah, why do we hate working? I mean, why do we have this idea that is your neighbor really going to start operating a tannery? Like I don't know what we're afraid of, So I mean, I think a lot of people are. I think again, it goes back to David's point. A lot of people are working at home. A lot of people. I mean, the example I use is, my husband has not seen a client in person for 25 years. I mean, he could literally be like, not shaved and in his pajamas and like, doing his job.
Well,
he's not, by the way. He goes to an office in Midtown, but I don't know why he does.
But in fact,
Maybe it's just to get away from home.
the difference is that starting with environmental legislation in the late 60s and early 70s, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, all these things have introduced exactly the kind of environmental regulations for which land use separation had been initially thought of. We don't have that fear anymore because we have controls. You can't pollute in the way you could in 1900. This is the 21st century with environmental regulations in place, and it's time that we recognize that, it seems to me.
One thing that struck me is often today we talked about masking density, hiding density as a kind of strategy for not somehow doing something destructive to our streets or our neighborhoods. And that certainly is part of it, but in order to really approach the problem and to communicate the problem, which is going to be a massive challenge to everyone who is concerned and whose support we do need, it's the opposite. It's revealing what the actual situation is and sort of pointing out that everyone is saying today, well, this is how people are actually living. Let's just look at that and say, that's how we live, and accommodate our regulations and our other systems and priorities to that. But I think communication to this broad public who really, we all get headache. I mean, I'm a professional, but I still get a headache just talking about zoning. I get a headache talking about a lot of these things. Imagine the average person who is going to need to be sold on this. They're living in Queens and they're going to want to know what's in it for them. And how can we communicate to that? How can we communicate that to them? I think is a very, very big problem.
Well, I think we've probably talked our way through all of this, and maybe we can have a little coffee.
Yes, and please, the reception tonight, on Mulberry Street, please just hang on to your name cards. Please come. It'll be, a lot of the same sort of very interesting, creative people, but we'll add alcohol. So I think you'll really enjoy it, and music. And it's at an old 1950s youth center, which is part of the old St. Patrick's Cathedral, and it's a wonderful complex of buildings if you've never been there, and it's right in Little Italy, so you won't starve to death. So hopefully we will see you all there tonight, and we'll continue the conversation. Thank you.